Close your eyes, cozy traveler. Lower the torchlight, pull the fur a little tighter around your shoulders, and let the wind outside do its thing. Tonight, we are going somewhere old, somewhere cold, somewhere that existed before anyone alive today could possibly remember it. We are going back into Skyrim, not to fight, not to sprint across a mountain chasing a quest marker, but to sit very still in the dark and listen to the world explain itself. There is so much this province has never bothered to tell you out loud. The answers are buried in books that most players never opened, carved into stone walls in a language that most characters never learned to read, whispered between characters who appear for 30 seconds and then walk away. We are going to find all of that tonight. Every hidden thread, every layer beneath the layer. By the time this is done, Skyrim will feel like a completely different place. So settle in, breathe slowly, let it wash over you. Part 1. The Dragon War and the World Before Memory. Long before the first human settlement on Tamriel's northern coast, before the companions set foot on Skyrim's shore, before the word Dragonborn meant anything at all, there was a world that operated on a completely different set of rules. A world where something ancient and enormous looked down from the mountains and saw human beings as something less than pets. Something to be organized, yes. Harvested, maybe. Worshipped through, certainly. But never, ever considered equal. This is where the story of Skyrim actually starts. Not at Helgen, not at the execution block. Here, in the Merethic Era. In an age so far removed from the Fourth Era that even the elves, who live for centuries and remember almost everything, can barely piece together what it looked like. The Dragon War. The event that shaped everything. The catastrophe that made humanity possible. To understand what the Dragon War actually was, you have to understand what dragons are at a level that goes beyond fire and scales and big wings. Dragons in the Elder Scrolls universe are not animals. They are not even particularly powerful animals who happen to be intelligent. They are something categorically different. When Akatosh, the dragon god of time, first breathed existence into the shape of Mundus, the mortal plane, he created the dove as an expression of himself. The oldest of them, Alduin, was there before linear time began, before cause and effect had the decency to run in one direction, before there was a before. Alduin and his kin did not evolve. They did not grow up. They simply were. In the same moment, the concept of being was first established. This matters because it means a dragon's relationship with language and reality is fundamentally different from a mortal's. When you or I speak a word, even a powerful word, we are describing something. We are pointing at it. We are gesturing in its direction. When a dragon speaks, something different happens. The language of the dove, Dovazul, is not a system of symbols that represent ideas. It is the actual fabric of those ideas, pressed into sound. When Alduin used the word for destruction, destruction happened. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The word and the thing it named were the same object, separated only by whether the dragon's mouth was open or closed. That is what the thu'um is. That is why mortal tongues, who spend decades learning even 3 words of it, can shatter stone and stop rivers and kill armed men at 100 yards just by shouting. They are not performing a magical trick. They are, in the most literal sense, rewriting small pieces of reality 1 syllable at a time. Now imagine a civilization run by creatures who can do that casually, in conversation, without thinking about it. Imagine that every dragon in Skyrim's mountain range has this power, and that they have had it for longer than the concept of civilization has existed, and that they have decided, in the way that beings of absolute power often decide, that this makes them gods. Not representatives of gods, not servants of gods, but gods themselves. In the early Merethic Era, this was simply accepted. Dragons did not need to conquer humanity by force, because force implies a contest that hasn't been decided yet. The decision had already been made. Humans in Skyrim, during the dragon cult's height, did not fight their overlords. They worshipped them. They built temples. They carved tribute into hillsides. They offered sacrifice. They organized their entire political and social structure around the hierarchy of dragons, with the most powerful dragon at the top and human beings at the very bottom, slotted in somewhere between livestock and ceremonial decoration. The dragon priests existed at the upper tier of this arrangement, human intermediaries who served specific dragons, managed the logistics of worship, enforced the cult's laws, and in exchange received magical knowledge and a certain protection that ordinary humans did not enjoy. In the early days, in Atmora, the frozen continent far to the north of Skyrim, where humanity originally came from, this arrangement had actually worked reasonably well. The ancient texts suggest that the first dragon priests were not the robed skeletal tyrants you encounter in Skyrim's tombs. They were genuine religious intermediaries, respected figures who brokered peace between dragons and humans, arranged the terms of tribute so that it was manageable, kept the relationship functional. Dragons provided protection from external threats and shared fragments of their knowledge. Humans provided worship, organization, and obedience. It was unequal, obviously. It was built on the fundamental premise that dragons deserved to rule simply by virtue of what they were. But it was not, in those first days, purely monstrous. Something changed when the dragon cult crossed the sea to Tamriel. Scholars have argued for centuries about exactly what happened, and the truth is probably layered. Alduin's influence grew stronger the more isolated his priest servants became from Atmora's traditions. The new land brought new pressures, new resources to fight over, new populations of elves who had their own gods and their own power structures, and who were not interested in organizing their lives around dragon worship. The priests, cut off from the moderating influence of older tradition, began to compete with each other. Dragons began to compete with each other. The hierarchical system that had once at least pretended to be mutually beneficial became something darker. The sacrifices grew more frequent. The laws grew crueler. The priests, who had once been diplomats, became executioners. By the time the Dragon War actually began in earnest, the humans of Skyrim were not fighting against the original dragon cult philosophy. They were fighting against what that philosophy had become a machine of domination that had run so long and grown so corrupted that it no longer even remembered what it had originally been built for. And still, they might have lost. The power imbalance was extraordinary. Humans had no way to permanently kill a dragon. Even if you managed to bring one down, and that alone required considerable armies and devastating losses, the dragon would simply wait in death for Alduin to resurrect it. Alduin had the unique ability, held by no other dragon, to breathe life back into fallen kin. The dragon's soul would remain anchored in its bones, waiting. This made every battle meaningless in the long run. You could kill the same dragon a dozen times across a dozen generations and never actually be free of it. The humans of Skyrim were not fighting a war. They were running in a wheel. The thing that changed was named Paarthurnax. Say the name slowly, if you like. In Dovazul, those three syllables mean ambition, overlord, cruelty, Par ambition, Thur overlord, Nax cruelty, a name that was probably given to him by Alduin himself, a name that described exactly what a dragon should be, a name that functioned as a statement of identity and purpose. And for most of the Merethic Era, Paarthurnax lived up to it completely. He was Alduin's lieutenant. His brother, in the way that dragons use that word, not blood, but bond, the connection between beings who emerged from the same divine source and operated within the same hierarchy for so long that the distinction between brotherhood and kinship became meaningless. Paarthurnax did not merely watch the atrocities of the Dragon War. He participated in them. He committed them. The ancient Nordic legends that survive about the Dragon War do not treat Paarthurnax as a sympathetic figure in those years. He is listed among the great oppressors, the burner of settlements, the creature whose shadow over a valley meant that the people in that valley were going to have a very bad day. What changed him, in the end, is something he himself finds difficult to articulate. He speaks to the Dragonborn about it at the throat of the world, thousands of years later, with a humility that is striking in a creature whose entire nature orients toward dominance. He says simply that he began to pity men, that watching the same suffering repeated across the same generations, the same fear in the same eyes, something shifted in whatever function in a dragon's awareness corresponds to conscience. He says this as if he is not entirely sure it explains anything, because he is not. What is certain is what he did. Paarthurnax went to the mortals. He found the three most powerful human tongues of the era, Gormlaith Golden Hilt, Hakon One Eye, and Feldir the Old, and he did the thing that no dragon had ever done before. He taught them the thu'um, not a single word, not a controlled fragment, carefully managed so humans could never actually threaten dragon power. The real thing, actual Dovazul, the philosophy and the practice and the understanding of what it meant to speak in the language that makes reality move. This was not merely a tactical shift. This was philosophical suicide for the dragon cult. Because the entire justification for dragon supremacy rested on a single argument: that dragons were categorically superior to humans, that their power over reality through the voice was an expression of divine right, that this hierarchy was not constructed by power, but ordained by the nature of existence itself. The moment one dragon stood in front of 3 human beings and said, "You can do this too," that argument collapsed. It did not collapse because humans had suddenly become physically equal to dragons. They had not. It collapsed because Paarthurnax had declared the premise false. He had said, from the inside of the system, that the justification for that system was a lie. Every dragon who continued to fight for Alduin after Paarthurnax's defection fought not for divine right, but simply for dominance. The difference between those two things is everything. Might makes right is a defensible philosophy, even if it is brutal, but it is a much harder thing to die for than cosmic destiny. The Dragon War became, in a meaningful sense, winnable the moment Paarthurnax opened his mouth. Even with the thu'um, though, the humans could not kill Alduin. The World Eater was simply too powerful, his connection to the flow of time too deep, his role in the structure of existence too fundamental. Feldir the Old, the oldest and wisest of the 3 tongues, had come to the battle with an Elder Scroll. These objects, which exist in Skyrim's ruins in damaged and partial forms, are not books. They are fragments of the universe's own record of itself. They are the parts of time that time wrote down. Using one is like reaching into the machinery of existence and pulling a lever, and you cannot be certain what lever you are pulling or what it will do when you pull it. Using one to manipulate time itself is extraordinarily dangerous. Hakon One Eye and Gormlaith Golden Hilt did not want to use it. They wanted to kill Alduin outright. They argued, loudly and passionately, that sending him away was not winning, it was delay. Feldir insisted there was no other way. And Feldir was right. The Dragon Wren's shout, which the 3 tongues had developed specifically to force Alduin to experience mortality, to briefly make him feel the finite, bounded, desperate quality of mortal existence that dragons are immune to, was enough to bring him down. But it was not enough to destroy him. So, they combined the Dragon Rend with the Elder Scroll, and they pushed Alduin out of the present. Not into death, into the future, an unknown point in the future when circumstances would be different, when perhaps the opportunity would exist for Alduin to complete his work. The throat of the world became the site of a temporal wound, a place where past, present, and future intersect in ways that are not quite natural, where magic behaves strangely, where the snow never melts because the metaphysical force released in that moment of time-breaking is still leaking into the physical world thousands of years later. The Elder Scroll that was used is still there, waiting. The scar in time is still there, shaping everything around it. Paarthurnax knew Alduin would return. He had always known. So he went to the throat of the world, and he stayed there for thousands of years, waiting, meditating, fighting every single day against the impulses that his nature drives him toward the desire to dominate, to rule, to impose, to consume. He calls it a continuous battle. He says that the struggle to be better than what you were made to be is not won once and then concluded. It is fought on every morning you choose to be still rather than to act on what every instinct in you demands. That is what he has been doing on that mountain for all that time. Not resting, fighting, just in a way that looks, from the outside, like sitting very quietly. After the Dragon War ended, the surviving dragons were hunted down by the Nords with a systematic thoroughness that speaks to how badly they wanted to make sure it never happened again. The dragon burial mounds you find scattered across Skyrim, those circular earthworks on hilltops and ridgelines with the stone sarcophagi at their center, are where the defeated dragons were interred by the last faithful, members of the dragon cult. These people believed, with complete sincerity, that Alduin would return and raise the fallen, so they kept faith. They maintained the graves. Across generations, across centuries, isolated cultists tended those mounds, leaving offerings, performing rites, staying in the cold and the wind, because they genuinely believed in their god's eventual return. The Draugr, who now guard those same mounds, are their descendants, reanimated cult members, who have been standing watch over their dragon masters for so long that death itself became insufficient reason to stop. When the Dragonborn first arrives at one of those mounds and watches a dragon claw its way out of the earth, they are watching the fulfillment of something that faithful people waited generations to see. The irony is that the dragon's first act upon resurrection is to fly to the nearest human settlement and set it on fire. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are and what time it is. Whether you are in bed with the lights off, or on a long drive in the dark, or curled up somewhere in between, I want to know. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. We are only just getting started. Part 2. The Dwemer. Engineers who tried to become gods. There is a particular flavor of ruin in Skyrim that feels different from the rest. Nordic ruins are cold and dark and full of the dead, but there is something still human about them. Carved stone, burial urns, the imagery of warriors and gods. Dwemer ruins are something else entirely. Walking into one feels less like entering a tomb and more like entering a machine that has been left running long after the machinists have gone. Gears still turn. Steam still hisses through pipes. Automatons still patrol corridors in patterns programmed thousands of years ago, maintaining a watch over spaces their creators can no longer inhabit. The lights are still on. No one is home. And the question of where everyone went is one of the most genuinely unsettling mysteries in all of gaming. The Dwemer, whose name in their own language roughly translates to people of the deep, though they are also called dwarves by most of Tamriel, a name they never used themselves and would have found condescending, were not merely an advanced civilization. They were an advanced civilization that had philosophically rejected the entire framework within which every other civilization in Tamriel operated. Everyone else on the continent, from the High Elves of the Somerset Isles to the Nords of Skyrim to the Khajiit of Elsewhere, organized their understanding of the world around divine beings, gods, Daedric princes, spirits, ancestors. Even those who did not actively worship divine beings shaped their philosophy in response to the existence of divine beings. The Dwemer looked at all of that and said, essentially, no. They were a people of pure empiricism in an age before the word had been invented. They believed that the apparent mystery of the divine was simply a problem that had not yet been subjected to sufficient analysis. Gods were not supernatural. They were phenomena that had not yet been explained. The thu'um was not a divine gift. It was a natural law that had not yet been fully mapped. The soul was not a sacred object. It was an energy with measurable properties that could be redirected, stored, and used as fuel. This was not the philosophy of atheism, exactly. The Dwemer did not deny that divine power existed. They denied that it deserved reverence. There is a meaningful difference. You can acknowledge that a thing has enormous power while still choosing to study it as an object rather than worship it as a subject. The Dwemer chose study, always. Their technology reflects this completely. Dwemer engineering is not magic supplemented by machinery. It is not mechanics supplemented by magic. It is something that does not have a clean category in modern understanding, because modern understanding still operates in those two separate columns. What the Dwemer had achieved was a synthesis. They called it tonal architecture. The underlying principle was that reality itself is fundamentally acoustic in nature, that existence, at its most basic level, is composed of vibrations and resonances, and that these vibrations can be detected, mapped, and manipulated by a sufficiently sophisticated intelligence using sufficiently precise instruments. This is why Dwemer machinery operates with no apparent power source. It is not powered by steam or magic or any conventional fuel. It is powered by resonance, by the fact that it has been tuned to specific frequencies of reality that are self-sustaining, the way a perfect fifth in music can go on and on once struck, vibrating in sympathy with the harmonics around it. The automatons, the centurions, the spheres, the spiders, the various clanking horrors that fill Dwemer ruins from Markarth to Mazark have been operational for more than 4,000 years, with no maintenance whatsoever. Think about that number. 4,000 years. The pyramids of Egypt are about 4,500 years old, and they require constant archaeological effort just to keep them from collapsing. The Dwemer built machines that just keep going, not because they are indestructible, though they are extraordinarily durable, but because they were made right, at a level that transcends the distinction between a mechanism and a law of nature. Paarthurnax was the chief architect of all of this. Not the only Dwemer engineer. There were hundreds of brilliant minds in their civilization, but the one who pushed furthest, who asked the most extreme version of the question that all Dwemer were always implicitly asking, what is the theoretical limit of what we can do? He found the heart of Lorcan. This requires some context. Lorcan, called Shor by the Nords, called the Missing God, the Trickster, the Doomdrum, by various other cultures, is one of the most complex figures in Elder Scrolls cosmology. He is the god who convinced the other original divine beings to sacrifice portions of their own power to build Mundus, the mortal plane. Depending on which culture's version of the story you prefer, this was either a profound act of creative love. Lorcan wanted mortals to exist because he believed that finite, struggling beings were capable of achieving something that infinite, perfect beings could not, or it was an enormous con, a deception that tricked the Aedra into giving up their divinity for a project they did not fully understand, possibly both. Elder Scrolls mythology is comfortable with things being both. What is consistent across most accounts is that Lorcan was destroyed for it. The other divine beings, realizing what had happened to their power, turned on him. They tore his heart from his body and flung it across the world. The heart fell on the island of Vardenfell, in what is now Morrowind, and came to rest beneath the volcano called Red Mountain. And there it stayed, an artifact of divine power, so immense that its presence warped the land around it, that the mountain above it became the center of magical upheaval for millennia, that civilizations rose and fell in its vicinity simply from the proximity to something that was not quite alive and not quite dead and not quite anything, that mortal language has the vocabulary to accurately name. Paarthurnax found it, and Paarthurnax, being Paarthurnax, did not worship it. He wrote about it. He dissected it philosophically. He authored a book called Divine Metaphysics that is still studied by scholars in the Fourth Era, a text that treats the creation of gods as an engineering problem to be solved through sufficiently careful analysis of inputs and outputs. He looked at the heart of Lorcan and asked, what if I used this? Not as a power source, exactly, as something more than a power source. What if I connected the entire Dwemer race to this divine artifact, built a resonant network, a tonal bridge between the accumulated consciousness of his people and this fragment of a god's actual being, and use that connection to elevate them? Not individually, all of them, simultaneously, the entire race transformed through pure engineering into something that transcended mortality. He built Numidium to do it, a massive brass golem, a mechanical body intended to house not a single person but a people, the brass god, the construct that would make divinity a technological achievement. He forged 3 tools, Hrothgar, Sunder, and Keening, specifically designed to interact with the heart in controlled, precise ways. Without the tools, touching the heart would be catastrophic. With them, Paarthurnax believed he could channel its power through Numidium and into his people in a controlled, directed process. The Battle of Red Mountain was supposed to be a military conflict. The Dwemer and the Chimer, the golden-skinned elves who would later become the Dunmer, had been fighting for dominance in Morrowind for generations, and the Nords had thrown their weight behind the conflict at various points. But what happened on Red Mountain in the First Era's 700th year was not primarily a battle. It was an experiment, and something went catastrophically, cosmically, irreversibly wrong. Every Dwemer alive on Tamriel, at every location, in every city, in every ruin, vanished simultaneously. Not sequentially, not regionally, not individually. All of them, at once. Their weapons fell. Their clothing dropped. Their seats held only air where people had been sitting moments before. Investigators who arrived at Dwemer settlements afterward found fresh meals still hot on tables, found beds still warm, found ongoing tasks left mid-stroke, a hammer mid-swing, a scroll mid-writing, a fire mid-tending. Whatever happened to the Dwemer, it did not give them time to finish a sentence. The automatons kept running, the machinery kept grinding, and the Dwemer themselves were just gone. What exactly happened has been debated by scholars for 4,000 years without consensus. The leading theories are several. That Paarthurnak's use of the tools on the heart effectively channeled every Dwemer soul into Numidium simultaneously, converting them all into the divine mechanical construct's animating force, in which case the Dwemer did not die, they became the brass god. That the resonant connection Paarthurnax created between his people and the heart overloaded when it was activated, and all the Dwemer were simply destroyed by the discharge? That they were scattered across time in the same way Alduin was scattered, and that somewhere, in some other era, Dwemer still exist and have no idea what happened? That they achieved exactly what Paarthurnax intended and transcended mortality in a way that placed them beyond the perceptibility of mortal senses, making them gods, in a sense, so complete that they are indistinguishable from absence. There is exactly one Dwemer who survived, Yagrum Bagarn. He had been traveling in the outer realms, a dimension adjacent to, but distinct from, the conventional planes at the moment of the disappearance, and when he returned, he found his entire civilization erased. He contracted corpus disease, a magical affliction that bloated and distorted his body, and he spent the rest of his existence in Morrowind in the care of a Telvanni mage. His massive diseased form, a living monument to being in the wrong place at the wrong time when everyone else in your entire civilization vanished. In Morrowind, you can find him, you can talk to him. He does not know what happened to his people either. He has had thousands of years to think about it, and he still does not know. The College of Winterhold in Skyrim's 4th era has its own data point on this question. A researcher named Arniel Gain became obsessed with understanding the Dwemer's fate. He obtained Keening, one of the 3 original tools, and performed a recreation of Paarthurnax's ritual using a soul gem in place of the heart itself. The result was instantaneous and identical. Arniel Gain simply vanished, same as the Dwemer. No flash, no sound, no residue. He performed the ritual, and then he was not there anymore. His ghost sometimes appears afterward to assist the Dragonborn in various ways, suggesting that he now exists in some indeterminate state, not quite in the world, not quite gone from it. Exactly, perhaps, what happened to his subjects of study. The deeper implication, the one that keeps you awake, if you think about it long enough, is that the Dwemer's rejection of the divine was not naive. They understood divine power. They understood it so well that they found a way to interact with it on an engineering level that no other civilization has ever attempted. The question of whether that interaction worked, or whether it destroyed them, or whether those two outcomes are the same thing, is still open. 4,000 years after the fact, the machinery is still running, waiting, perhaps, for whoever built it to come back. Part 3. Blackreach, a kingdom beneath kingdoms. Most players who first stumble into Blackreach do so by accident. They are threading through the depths of Ulftand, or Raldbthar, following a quest marker, and then suddenly the tunnel opens and the world falls away, and they are standing on the edge of something that should not exist. A cavern so vast that the ceiling is lost in bioluminescent darkness 100 meters overhead, glowing mushrooms the size of houses. A faintly visible artificial sun hanging at the center of the space, casting pale golden light over the ruins of an underground civilization. The scale is genuinely disorienting. You did not expect this. No one ever expects this. Blackreach is called Fal Jardim Din in the Dwemer language. Translated, that means something like, the blackest kingdom reaches. It is an immense natural cavern system that runs beneath most of Skyrim's 9 holds. Beneath the Pale, beneath Winterhold, beneath Havmark, beneath Hrothgar, possibly extending further. The Dwemer found it and they built in it, but they did not create it. Something else was there first. The first inhabitants of Blackreach, according to the oldest fragments of lore, were vampires. Not the organized vampire clans of the 4th era, not the Volkihar with their Gothic castle and their elaborate blood politics. Something older. The first vampire bloodlines, descended from Lamé Beolfag, the first person ever transformed by Molag Bal's original act of violation, made their way underground in the Merethic Era and established kingdoms in the dark. They built Greymoor Keep, a fortress that predates even the Dwemer's arrival in Skyrim, in the caverns beneath what would later become Hrothgar Hold, beneath the very location where Solitude would eventually be founded. The deep dark-suited vampires. No sunlight, abundant prey, in the form of whatever unlucky travelers could be lured underground, a defensible position against those who might hunt them. When the Dwemer arrived and began expanding into the cave system, they found a realm that was already inhabited, already politically complex, already layered with the residue of centuries of vampire civilization. They did not coexist peacefully. The Dwemer were not a people who coexisted peacefully with anyone when territory was at stake. But the relationship between the Dwemer and the vampire clans of Blackreach was also not simple extermination. The vampires were powerful, organized, and had been underground long enough to know the cavern systems in ways the Dwemer did not. What developed was something closer to an uneasy arrangement, punctuated by conflict, that gave the Dwemer access to the cave network while the vampire clans maintained certain strongholds. The Nighthollow clan had their keep in the Reaches section of Blackreach, in a region called Arkzand Cavern. They were unlike most vampires in a specific and fascinating way. They had stopped feeding on blood. Instead, they drew sustenance from a Daedric artifact called the Dark Heart, an object associated with Namira, the Daedric Prince of Darkness and Revulsion. The Dark Heart was a source of power that the Nighthollow clan had discovered and learned to tap, trading the conventional vampire dependency on living blood for this alternative fuel source. They had organized their entire society around it. Their hierarchy, their spiritual practices, their sense of identity, all of it revolved around maintaining access to this artifact. The Dwemer, being the Dwemer, studied the Dark Heart. Then they took it. They drained most of its power through their analytical tools before returning it to the Nighthollow clan in a depleted state, because they wanted to understand what they had observed during the study. This was not cruelty exactly, it was just Dwemer methodology, applied to something that other people considered sacred. The consequences were catastrophic for the Nighthollow clan. With the Dark Heart's power largely siphoned away, the vampires who had become dependent on it began to starve. The clan's leader, Lady Belaine, used what remained of the artifact's power for herself, and watched her clan deteriorate around her. The War of the Crag fought between the enslaved snow elves, who had become the Falmer and their Dwemer masters, was happening simultaneously in these same cavern networks, and the Nighthollow clan found themselves caught between multiple collapsing power structures at once. When the Dwemer vanished in the First Era's 700th year, the surviving Falmer inherited Blackreach. They were free, suddenly and without warning, after generations of enslavement, but they were also blinded, physically deteriorated, stripped of their culture and their language and their memory of who they had been. Freedom did not restore what had been taken from them. They simply occupied the ruins of their former masters, operating the lowest level of Dwemer machinery by instinct and rote, gradually losing even that as the centuries passed. The artificial sun at Blackreach's center is a product of Dwemer engineering that has never been satisfactorily explained. It is not a light source in any conventional sense. It illuminates the cavern as completely as full daylight, but it has been running for over 4,000 years with no maintenance. Vampires who enter Blackreach and are exposed to it experience the same damage from it as they would from actual sunlight, suggesting that the Dwemer somehow replicated the anti-undead blessing of Magnus's hole in reality inside an underground space. Whether this was intentional, whether the Dwemer specifically designed their underground light source to harm vampires, perhaps to control the cave's previous inhabitants, or whether it was a side effect of how they generated the light, is unknown. Volthuriol is there, in Blackreach, a dragon sealed deep in the cavern network that has been there since before the events of Skyrim's main quest. He is not in a burial mound. He is simply present in an enormous chamber and has been there for long enough that no one in the surface world knows he exists. He sleeps, or he meditates, or he does whatever ancient dragons do when they are left completely alone in an underground space for thousands of years, undisturbed by the Falmer, who probably learned very quickly not to go in his direction. When the Dragonborn shouts to wake him, Volthuriol is disoriented and immediately hostile, not because he is inherently evil, but because being woken from what might be a multi-century rest by a very loud noise in your home would make most people hostile. He is one of the few dragons in Skyrim whose presence there is genuinely mysterious. Why is he in Blackreach? Did the Dwemer put him there? Did he choose it? Has he been there since before the Dwemer arrived? No one, including Volthuriol himself, has explained. The crimson nirnroot that grows only in Blackreach is biologically unique to this environment. Nirnroot is rare on the surface, a plant that glows softly in the dark and makes a faint chiming sound, used in alchemy and sought by scholars. In Blackreach, the same plant grows deep red, colored by the specific mineral composition of the cavern's soil and the peculiar quality of the artificial sun's light. It cannot be cultivated on the surface. Take it out of Blackreach, and it will not grow. It is specific to this underground world in the way that some deep-sea creatures are specific to a depth of ocean where sunlight never reaches, evolved for an environment so particular that it cannot adapt to any other. The quest given by Sindarian, a deceased alchemist whose body you find in a field station in Blackreach, killed by the Falmer, who did not appreciate a scholar wandering through their territory, taking plant samples, asks the Dragonborn to collect 30 of these crimson nirnroot specimens. There is no map marker. The game provides minimal guidance. Players who have not done this quest often cite it as one of Skyrim's most frustrating experiences, a hunt through a vast cavern for a specific plant that requires patience and systematic exploration rather than quick navigation from objective to objective. But this frustration is, arguably, the point. Bethesda spent enormous resources building Blackreach. It is one of the most expensive to create environments in the game, in terms of pure development effort. The scale, the lighting system, the biologically distinct flora, the ruins of a full underground city, the roads and tunnels and enormous chamber sequences. If players could sprint through it following a quest marker, most of them would not see any of it. The Crimson Nirnroot quest is a mechanism for forcing people to slow down and look, to navigate by landmark rather than by indicator, to notice the glowing vines and the way the artificial light falls differently on different geological formations, to stand still for a moment and absorb the fact that they are standing in the ruins of a civilization inside the largest cave in all of gaming. The reward for collecting all 30 Sindarian's serendipity, a perk that grants a 10% chance to create an additional potion when using alchemy, is not spectacular by Skyrim standards. It is not a uniquely powerful weapon or a particularly significant upgrade. The real reward is having walked the length of Blackreach slowly enough to understand what it is. That is not a consolation prize. That is the game doing something unusual, teaching attention. The roads the Dwemer built in Blackreach are still there, still navigable. They connected Alftand, Mzinkaleft, and Raldbethar, 3 of the major Dwemer cities in Skyrim, through the underground network, allowing transport and communication between them without ever having to go to the surface. The Dwemer preferred underground. It gave them control over their environment in ways the surface did not. You cannot manage weather from a mountaintop, but you can manage the humidity and temperature and structural integrity of a cave network if you are clever enough. And the Dwemer were always clever enough. What is left now is one of the most haunting spaces in all of gaming. The empty city at Blackreach's center, the Silent City, as the Falmer have come to call it, in whatever fragmentary communication they maintain with each other, is the physical remainder of a civilization that believed it could transcend mortality through engineering. The lights are still on, the machinery is still running, and somewhere in the deepest part of that underground, past the Falmer camps and the glowing mushrooms and the strange cold light, there is a dragon sleeping and waiting for something that may never come. Part 4. The Snow Elves and the Fall of a Civilization. Before the Nords. Before the dragon cult arrived in Tamriel. Before Wisegrammar or Sarthal or anything that most people know as Skyrim history, there was a civilization on this land that had built something beautiful. The Snow Elves, the Falmer, as they are called in the later human records, though they did not call themselves that, were a sophisticated and prosperous people. Their culture approached, in some respects, the heights of Altmeri achievement. They had their own religion, organized around the worship of Ariel, the elven interpretation of the dragon god of time. They had their own architecture, their own art, their own philosophical traditions. They were, in the Merethic Era, the masters of the northern land that humans would later name Skyrim. The Chantry of Oriel, hidden in the Forgotten Vale in western Skyrim, one of the most beautiful locations in the game, a glacial valley of frozen waterfalls and ancient architecture that players can access through the Dawnguard questline, was one of the Snow Elves' most sacred spaces. It was not merely a temple, it was a pilgrimage destination. Snow elves, who dedicated themselves to the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment, undertook a lengthy journey through its halls, carrying the desire to become one with their god. The Vale itself, surrounded by mountains and accessible only through secret passages, was pristine, untouched by the external conflicts that affected the rest of their civilization. A paradise maintained by devoted guardians. The fall of the Snow Elves began with the humans from Atmora. The Atmorans Ysgramr's people arrived on Tamriel's northern coast in the Merethic Era, fleeing civil war in their homeland. The first contact between the Atmorans and the Snow Elves was not immediately catastrophic. For a period, they coexisted on the same land, with a wariness that had not yet become violence. The humans built the settlement of Saarthal, one of the first major human settlements in Skyrim, and for a time, the two peoples occupied the same geography with a precarious but functional arrangement. What broke the arrangement was what lay beneath Saarthal. Deep under the earth beneath the settlement, the Snow Elves knew, was the Eye of Magnus, an artifact so powerful that no one who understood what it was could allow any other party to possess it. The Eye predates conventional Elder Scrolls history. Some scholars believe it is a remnant from a previous Kalpa, a fragment of a universe that existed before the current one began, somehow preserved through the end of one world and the beginning of the next. Others theorize it is a direct conduit to Magnus himself, the architect of reality's magical framework, a tier in existence providing access to raw creative power. What everyone agrees on is that it is extraordinarily dangerous when active, capable of threatening the fundamental structure of reality in ways that normal magic cannot. The Snow Elves could not allow the humans to possess it. So on the Night of Tears, Tamriel's most poignant name for an atrocity, the Snow Elves attacked Saarthal. They did not attack to kill the settlers, exactly. They attacked to get to what was beneath the settlers. They burned the settlement. They killed most of its population. The survivors fled, and among the survivors were members of Ysgramr's own family. Ysgramr himself had been away when the attack happened. He returned to find Ash. What followed was not justice, it was revenge, pursued with the methodical, systematic ferocity that makes genuine grief capable of becoming genuine atrocity. Ysgramr returned to Atmora and told the story of the Night of Tears, and the story did its work, and eventually he sailed back south with 500 companions, warriors whose names and individual deeds were recorded in Nordic legend. Each one a hero in their own right, collectively the founding population of what would become Nordic civilization in Skyrim. They were not settlers. They were, at that point in their mission, an extermination force. The express purpose of the 500 companions was the destruction of Snow Elf civilization. They were successful. The Snow Elves, who had been a sophisticated and prosperous people, were hunted across the length and breadth of the province. They fought back. The war lasted long enough that there are dated records of Snow Elf military resistance surviving into the First Era, but they could not hold the land. City by city, valley by valley, sacred space by sacred space, they were driven out. Some were killed, some fled underground. Some reached isolated shrines and hidden temples and sealed themselves away from the conflict. Those who fled underground had very few options. The underground of Skyrim was Dwemer territory. The Dwemer were not allies of the Snow Elves. They were not allies of anyone, really, but they were not the Nords. The Snow Elves who approached the Dwemer cities came not as threats or equals, but as refugees seeking asylum. They said, in effect, "We have nowhere else to go. We will work for you. We will serve you. We just need shelter from the people who are killing us." The Dwemer agreed. This is where the story becomes, in the coldest possible way, worse than the genocide that preceded it. The condition for shelter, the Dwemer told the Snow Elves, was that they must eat the fungi that grew in the Dwemer's underground, a specific mushroom cultivated in the deep caverns. The Snow Elves accepted, because what choice did they have? They were starving, hunted, exhausted, and the alternative was returning to the surface to be killed by Ysgramr's forces. They ate the fungi, and the fungi, as the Dwemer had known it would, blinded them. Permanently, completely, not in one generation permanently. The poison was thorough enough that it corrupted the Snow Elves' biology at a level that passed to their descendants. Their children were born blind. Their grandchildren were born blind. Every generation of snow elf that came after that moment of trusting desperation was born unable to see. This was not an accident. This was not an unforeseen side effect of underground nutrition. This was deliberate. The Dwemer had designed the blindness as a control mechanism. A blinded slave population is a dependent slave population. You cannot escape what you cannot see. You cannot organize a rebellion through written communication if you cannot read. You cannot study the machinery of your captors and learn to defeat it if you cannot observe it. The blindness was a tool of domination, as calculated and precise as any piece of Dwemer engineering. Knight Paladin Gelibor, the only snow elf known to have survived the fall of his civilization uncorrupted, preserved by Auriel in the Chantry of the Forgotten Vale, calls his people's descendants the betrayed, not the Falmer, not the snow elves. The betrayed, the ones who came to the Dwemer for sanctuary and were converted instead into tools. Over the centuries of their enslavement, blinded and kept underground and worked, the snow elves changed in ways that went beyond the loss of sight. They lost language, they lost culture, they lost the memory of who they had been. Their bodies changed. The elegant, beautiful snow elf physique that rivaled any other elven race was replaced, over generations of underground life and poor nutrition and brutal labor, with something lean and feral and hunched. By the time the Dwemer vanished in the First Era's 700th year, and the enslaved snow elves were suddenly, confusingly free, the creatures moving through Blackreach's dark passages were barely recognizable as the descendants of the civilization that had built the Chantry of Auriel. The Falmer you encounter in Skyrim, the blind, aggressive, chitinous armored creatures who fill Dwemer ruins and attack on hearing anything approach, are these people. They are not monsters. They are the endpoint of one of Tamriel's greatest tragedies, a civilization that had their sight stolen, their culture erased, their memory destroyed, their identity dismantled, and then were left alone in the dark when their oppressors vanished. By the Fourth Era, the Falmer have been slowly, painfully beginning to reclaim intelligence. Their camps are more organized than they were. Their tools are more sophisticated. There is evidence, in some of the deeper ruins, that they are developing something that might eventually become a written language again. They are fighting their way back toward personhood across a gulf of suffering that is thousands of years deep. Gelibor, in the Forgotten Vale, speaks of them with grief rather than contempt. He calls them his brethren. He says he hopes that one day a line of communication might be established, that the Falmer might be reached and spoken to and brought back to something closer to what they were. He has been waiting, alone, in that beautiful vale for thousands of years, his brother and fellow guardians long since dead, his civilization gone, his faith the only thing he has maintained with any certainty. He is not bitter, he is patient. He says Auriel's time is not mortal time, and that things which seem permanent to a mortal might be temporary to a god. He is still waiting for something to get better. Whether it ever will is a question the lore has not yet answered. The Forgotten Vale itself, that secret space the snow elves maintained as their most holy sanctuary, it is still there. The frozen waterfalls are still frozen. The architecture is still standing. The plant life that the snow elves cultivated, species found nowhere else in Skyrim, is still growing. Walking through it, you are walking through the most beautiful thing that civilization built, perfectly preserved and perfectly empty. What the snow elves lost when they trusted the Dwemer is on display in the Forgotten Vale in a way that 1,000 words of lore text could not quite convey. It was gorgeous. It was theirs. And it has been waiting, without them, for the entire history of recorded Tamriel. Part 5. Sovngarde and the Geometry of the Nordic Soul. Nords are often reduced, in popular understanding, to the stereotype of large warriors who hit things and shout, and there is something true in that they do hit things and shout, and they are very good at both. But underneath the warrior culture, underneath the mead halls and the battle poems, and the very sincere enthusiasm for axes, there is a cosmological worldview of genuine complexity. The Nordic understanding of reality, of the soul, of death, of time, of divinity. It is a complete system with internally consistent logic, and it leads to a place called Sovngarde. Sovngarde is the Nordic afterlife. More specifically, it is a division of Aetherius, the immortal plane, the dimension of pure magical energy that exists beyond the mortal world's sky, which the Nords understand as the place where the gods withdrew after giving portions of themselves to build Mundus. Aetherius is where all magical energy in the world originally comes from. Every fireball spell, every healing potion, every enchanted blade, the power that animates these things flows into the mortal world through the stars, which the Nords, and this is one of their cosmology's most striking ideas, understand as holes in the sky. Think about that for a moment. When you look up at a night sky full of stars, what you are actually seeing, according to Nordic cosmology, is the places where the original divine beings escaped. When the gods who cooperated to build Mundus realized what they had done, that creating the mortal world had cost them significant portions of their divine power, many of them fled. They tore through the fabric of reality and escaped to Aetherius before the process could drain them completely. The stars are the exit wounds, the holes they tore in their rush to get out. And the light you see coming through those holes is not stellar physics, it is magical energy, divine power, leaking from Aetherius into the mortal world, through the scars the gods left in the fabric of existence when they ran. This is why magic exists in Tamriel. Not because the world was designed with magic built in, but because the roof has holes in it and something powerful is leaking through. The sun is the largest hole Magnus's escape route, since he was the first and most decisive of the gods to leave, and he made a bigger hole than anyone else. The fact that sunlight damages vampires is not merely biological, it is metaphysical. Magnus's exit from Mundus was sanctified against undeath by the elven interpretation of Akatosh, meaning the light coming through his hole specifically carries anti-undead properties. Vampires do not suffer from sunlight because they are light-sensitive creatures. They suffer from sunlight because the light is divine, and the divine principle associated with that particular opening in reality is antithetical to undeath. Sovngarde sits at the edge of Aetherius, a sub-realm created by and maintained by Shor, who is the Nordic interpretation of Lorcan, the god who convinced the others to build the mortal world and paid for it with his life. Shor and Lorcan are the same being processed through different cultural frameworks. The elves regard Lorcan as a trickster or a villain, someone who deceived the other gods into sacrificing their power for a project that benefited mortals at the expense of divine beings. The Nords regard Shor as a fallen champion, someone who gave up his existence so that humans could have a world to live in, and who now waits in Sovngarde to welcome the worthy dead when they arrive. The Hall of Valor is Shor's feast hall in Sovngarde, and it is where the greatest Nord warriors go when they die in honorable combat. Shor's throne is always empty when visitors arrive. The lore suggests he considers Sovngarde his home, but is not physically present there in a form that mortals can perceive. The heroes who dwell in the hall spend eternity in the way that the Nordic ideal imagines eternity: feasting, sparring, telling stories, competing, celebrating the deeds of their lives while waiting for a call to battle that may or may not eventually come. It is a warrior's heaven designed by warriors, and within the logic of Nordic culture, it is entirely coherent. But the path to Sovngarde is not automatic, and this is where it gets complicated. Nords who die in dishonor, who are cowardly, or who break sacred oaths, or who die in a way that violates the warrior code, do not reach Sovngarde. They end up in other, less pleasant corners of existence. The Draugr are evidence of this. They are not exactly undead in the conventional necromantic sense. They were not raised by a necromancer. They are, in the understanding of Nordic lore, the restless dead who were either bound to their tombs by the dragon cult's binding magic, or who failed to qualify for Sovngarde and find themselves caught between worlds, restless and angry, and unable to resolve the situation. Lycanthropy, the condition that the companion's inner circle carries, the werewolf curse obtained from Hircine's blessing through a ritual, is specifically understood in Nordic theology as a barrier to Sovngarde. The beast blood corrupts the soul. It marks the soul as belonging, at least in part, to Hircine's hunting grounds rather than to Shor's domain. A Nord warrior who dies while carrying the werewolf curse does not go to Sovngarde. They go to the hunting grounds, Hircine's plane of oblivion, where they hunt forever in wolf form at Hircine's pleasure. This is not necessarily a bad existence by some standards. There are werewolves who choose it deliberately, but for a Nord who has spent their life in honorable service, fighting with the expectation that they will reach Sovngarde, It is a profound betrayal of the promise they believed they were keeping. Codlac Whitemane, the harbinger of the companions when the Dragonborn arrives, is caught in exactly this situation. He contracted lycanthropy years ago as part of joining the Circle the Companions' inner leadership through a ritual that he agreed to without fully understanding its theological implications. By the time players meet him, he has come to hate the condition with a quiet, settled grief. He does not hate the power. He does not hate what the beast blood does for his combat effectiveness. He hates what it will cost him when he dies. He is an old man who has spent a long life in honorable service, who has held the companions together through genuine leadership and genuine wisdom, and who knows that when he dies, he will not see Sovngarde. He will go to her sign, and that is not where he wants to go. The quest to cure him, which continues even after his death, because he dies before a cure is found, is one of the companions' questline's most emotionally resonant elements. You are not just completing a task, you are correcting an injustice done to someone who deserved better. You are fighting, in a very literal sense, for the right of a good person to rest in the place they earned. The companions themselves are older than any individual Nord's memory of them. They were not founded in Skyrim. Wisegrammer's original 500 companions sailed from Atmora and brought the tradition with them. The Jorvaskr, the overturned longship that serves as the companions' hall in Whiterun, is not symbolic, it is the actual vessel, or part of it. The ship that some of the first humans sailed south from Atmora was dragged inland from the coast by those original companions, and a hall was built around its upturned hull, and that structure has been the companions' home ever since. It is the oldest continuously occupied building in Skyrim. When you sit in the Jorvaskr and listen to the older companions talk, you are sitting inside a ship that crossed the ocean in an age before recorded history. The stars above Sovngarde form the same constellations found on the standing stones scattered across Skyrim: the mage, the warrior, the thief. This is not decorative coincidence. It is a statement about the relationship between the mortal world and the afterlife. The same shapes, the same patterns, the same divine light bleeding through the same holes. Wherever you are under the same sky. Even in death, the geography of the soul echoes the geography of the world. There are no animals in Sovngarde, which creates a quiet paradox. The Hall of Valor is full of food, meat in abundance, and yet nothing lives there in the way that living things live on Mundus. The Norse-inspired logic of Sovngarde suggests that the food simply is, that a hall generous enough to accommodate the honored dead of all Nordic history is generous enough to provide for their appetites without needing a farm to sustain it. Shore's generosity is not bounded by the ordinary mechanics of production and consumption. What exists in Sovngarde exists because it belongs there, and nourishment for warriors belongs there as surely as the warriors themselves. The three heroes who defeated Alduin the first time, Gormlaith Goldenhilt, Hakon One-Eye, and Feldir the Old, are in Sovngarde when the Dragonborn arrives. They have been there since their deaths, feasting and sparring and waiting in the way that dead heroes wait. And when Alduin comes to the soul of the realm to feed on its residents, trapping them in mist, consuming their essences to increase his own power, they are among those unable to escape. The Dragonborn's arrival in Sovngarde is the first time in those heroes' afterlife that anything has happened to them that they did not expect. They had believed Alduin permanently defeated. They had believed the Elder Scroll solution permanent. Learning that the World Eater they banished in time eventually returned, and that the return was more or less what Feldir predicted it would be, is a particular kind of uncomfortable vindication. The mist that Alduin uses in Sovngarde to obscure his prey is worth dwelling on. He is consuming souls. Not killing the dead, they are already dead, but consuming the portion of existence that constitutes their identity and experience. A soul consumed by Alduin does not rest in Sovngarde or anywhere else. It is simply gone, returned to an undifferentiated mass, the constituent parts of a person absorbed into the World Eater's growing power. This is Alduin's true function, the cosmic role he abandoned in pursuit of temporal dominance over mortals. At the end of each world cycle, each kalpa, it is Alduin who is supposed to consume the world's accumulated existence and clear the way for a new one to begin. He is not evil by design. He is a function of existence that chose to become something else. Part 6. The Dark Brotherhood and the Voice of Sithis. There is a room in Windhelm where a child named Aventus Aretino has been sitting for days. He is surrounded by the materials of a ritual, a crude effigy of a human figure, stabbed repeatedly with a knife, surrounded by bones and nightshade and candles and the hushed, repetitive chanting of words that most people in Tamriel have enough sense to never speak aloud. He is performing the Black Sacrament. He is trying to summon the Dark Brotherhood. He is 9 years old. The organization he is trying to contact is one of the most ancient, most secretive, and most theologically complex institutions in Tamriel. It is not merely a guild of assassins. It is not even primarily a guild of assassins, though assassination is certainly its primary practical function. It is a religious organization, organized around the worship of something that may not be a god in any conventional sense, structured through millennia of tradition and theology and ritual that gives every killing performed in its name the character of a sacrament. Sithis, the void, the dark, the primordial nothing that existed before creation, is the Brotherhood's object of devotion. But Sithis is not a Daedric prince. It is not a god in the Elder Scrolls cosmology's usual framework. It does not have a plane of oblivion to rule. It does not have desires in the way that Molag Bal desires domination, or Hermaeus Mora desires knowledge. Sithis is, in the Brotherhood's understanding, the fundamental principle of entropy, the force of change, the inevitability of endings, the void that existed before anything, and to which all things will eventually return. It is the formless presence of non-existence, the counterpoint to creation, where Anu, the opposing primordial force, represents stasis and permanence and the desire to maintain what is. Sithis represents change and dissolution and the certainty that nothing lasts. Worshipping such a thing is not like worshipping a conventional deity. You cannot appeal to its mercy. You cannot make requests and receive boons. You can only serve it by accelerating the process it embodies, by hastening the return of things to nothingness. Every murder the Brotherhood commits is, in their theological framework, an act of worship, not because they like killing, because they understand themselves as instruments of an inevitable cosmic principle. Death comes for everyone. The Brotherhood simply arrives early. The Night Mother is the bridge between this incomprehensible void entity and the practical business of running an assassin's guild. She is the Brotherhood's founder, its spiritual leader, the conduit through whom Sithis's will is expressed in actionable form. Her story, as recorded in the book known as The Night Mother's Truth, is one of the darkest origin myths in the Elder Scrolls universe. She was a Dunmer woman, her name is never given in the surviving records, who lived during a period when the Morag Tong was the dominant guild of sanctioned killers in Morrowind and surrounding regions. The Morag Tong is the Brotherhood's predecessor, an organization that predates it and from which the Brotherhood eventually split. Where the Brotherhood serves Sithis, the Morag Tong served the Daedric prince Mephala, the prince of murder, secrets, and webs. The Morag Tong operated within Dunmer law, performing legally sanctioned killings under writs approved by religious authority. They were, in their way, as structured and formal as any court institution. Assassination as bureaucracy. The Dunmer woman claimed to hear the voice of Sithis, who told her that the Morag Tong's approach was insufficient. The void was hungry, more souls were needed, and she, specifically, was the one destined to provide them. According to the Brotherhood's legend, Sithis then visited her and gave her 5 children, and 2 years later, following the Dreadlord's instruction, she killed them all. She sent her own children's souls to the void, to Sithis, as a founding offering. The community where this happened responded as communities generally do to mothers who murder their children. She was killed, her house was burned, but 30 years later, somewhere else, a man began hearing a voice in his head, a gentle, comforting voice that identified itself as the Night Mother. She charged him with founding a new organization, one devoted not to Mephala's political webs, but to Sithis's hunger for souls. The Dark Brotherhood was born. It is worth noting that scholars and historians within the Elder Scrolls universe dispute several aspects of this account. Some argue that the Night Mother was actually an aspect of Mephala all along, that the distinction between Sithis worship and Mephala worship is a constructed mythology that the Brotherhood invented to justify its independence from the Morag Tong. Others argue that the Night Mother's identity has shifted across the millennia, that the title has been held by multiple women at different points in history, that there is no single continuous Night Mother, but rather an ongoing spiritual office. The Brotherhood itself holds to the canonical version: one woman, one act, one founding. Her mummified corpse rests in a coffin that travels with the Brotherhood, maintained by the eccentric, devoted, deeply broken figure of Cicero. Cicero was, before madness claimed most of what he had been, a competent and sincere assassin. He had served the Brotherhood in Cyrodiil during the period when the organization began to collapse, when members died or abandoned the cause, when sanctuaries fell, when the network that had sustained the Brotherhood for centuries began to unravel. He watched it happen, one loss at a time. He watched companions die. He watched brothers and sisters leave. He watched the organization that had given his life structure and meaning deteriorate around him until he was alone, just him and the Night Mother's coffin. He spent years over a decade as the sole remaining member of what had once been Cyrodiil's powerful Brotherhood chapter, alone in an empty sanctuary, talking to a corpse, maintaining rituals that no living person could observe, keeping faith with an organization that had effectively ceased to exist. The madness that players find in him when he arrives in Skyrim is not sudden onset. His journals document it, the gradual fracturing of a personality under the sustained pressure of complete isolation and the weight of being the only person keeping a tradition alive. He sings. He dances. He laughs at things that are not funny. He has the cheerfulness of someone who broke a long time ago and landed somewhere unexpected on the other side of the break. But here is what Cicero's madness preserved. He knew the theology. He knew the 5 tenets, the absolute laws governing Brotherhood members, with the completeness of someone who had nothing to do for years except recite them to a corpse. The 5 tenets: never steal from a fellow member, never kill a fellow member, never betray the Brotherhood, always obey the sanctuary's leader unless it violates the preceding tenets, never refuse a contract. These are not suggestions, they are not guidelines, they are doctrine, and violating them historically meant immediate execution without appeal. The Brotherhood's survival across multiple eras of active suppression by imperial authorities. The Penitus Oculatus hunted them. The Blades hunted them. The Thalmor would have hunted them if they had bothered to acknowledge the Brotherhood's relevance, is a direct function of the tenets' enforcement. Organizations that maintain absolute internal discipline are extraordinarily difficult to destroy from the outside. Every member who might be captured and forced to give information knows that giving information means death when the Brotherhood finds out. Every member who might be turned to serve as a spy knows the same thing. The information security created by the tenets is more effective than any encryption. Astrid's eventual betrayal: she is the Skyrim Sanctuary's leader when the Dragonborn arrives, and she eventually sells the Brotherhood to the Empire in a desperate attempt to protect her family. Unit of members is what destroys the Skyrim chapter. She breaks 2 tenets simultaneously. The Brotherhood that the Dragonborn can rebuild in Dawnstar afterward is a ghost of what the organization was at its height, operating from a sanctuary that is small and isolated and served by a handful of members. But the Night Mother is there. And while the Night Mother is there, the Black Sacrament can be heard. And while it can be heard, the Brotherhood is not truly dead, merely wounded and waiting, as it has been wounded and waiting several times before across the centuries. Aventus Aretino's Black Sacrament is heard. It reaches the Night Mother, who passes it to the Dragonborn, who becomes the first listener the Brotherhood has had in years. The target of Aventus's ritual is Grelod the Kind, the woman who runs Honor Hall Orphanage in Riften, with a brutality that the name above the door does not remotely suggest. She beats children. She starves children. She tells children that no one will ever adopt them, that they will die in the orphanage, that they deserve no better. When Aventus escaped and performed the Black Sacrament, he had already tried every other avenue available to a 9-year-old, with no family and no resources. He had spoken to the guards. He had spoken to the Jarl's officials. He had spoken to every adult he could find, and no one had done anything. So he stole his mother's remains, learned a forbidden ritual from somewhere he will not say, and spent days in the dark chanting for death to come. When you kill Grelod and return to Aventus, his relief is not violent or gloating. It is quiet. He thanks you. He says the other children will be safe now. He offers you a family heirloom as payment, something he had presumably been keeping as one of the only things he still owned from before. The exchange is very small and very quiet. and very devastating if you think about what it represents. A child who had no recourse, who did something terrible because no decent option existed, who is relieved that an assassin came when the authorities would not. The moral complexity of the Dark Brotherhood questline begins at exactly this moment and never fully resolves. Part 7. Talos, the man who became a god. In the market district of Whiterun near the central square, there is a man named Hrothgar who is shouting. He is always shouting. He has a wild, desperate quality that most players find immediately irritating. He is loud, he is repetitive, he is standing in the same spot in all weather conditions, declaring his faith to anyone who will listen, and quite a few people who have indicated very clearly that they would prefer not to. Guards suggest he be moved. Other citizens complain about the noise. He shouts anyway. What he is shouting about is Talos, and the reason he cannot stop, the reason the volume has gone up and the arguments have become increasingly unhinged, is not madness, it is desperation. Before we dismiss Hrothgar as flavor text on the street corner, it is worth understanding what he was and what happened to him, because his story is actually one of the most quietly devastating character portraits in the game. Before the White Gold Concordat, the treaty signed in the Second Era between the Aldmeri Dominion and the Empire that ended the Great War and banned the worship of Talos throughout all of Imperial territory. Hrothgar was not a street preacher, he was a scholar. His academic focus was Nordic theology, specifically the metaphysical implications of Talos's inclusion in the Nine Divines. He published research, he corresponded with other scholars. He was, by all accounts, a respected figure in the academic community that studied religious questions. When the White Gold Concordat took effect and Talos worship became illegal, Hrothgar's research, which had concluded that removing Talos from the divine pantheon would have genuine metaphysical consequences, that the theological structure of reality was changed by Talos's ascension and would be damaged by the denial of it, suddenly became heresy. His expertise became a liability. The same conclusions that had earned him academic respect now marked him as an enemy of imperial law. He began preaching publicly because he believed that silence was complicity. He believed that the Thalmor ban was not merely a political overreach, but a genuine spiritual corruption, that by denying Talos's divinity, the Concordat was denying a metaphysical truth with real-world consequences. His measured academic arguments, he found, convinced no one in the practical world of people trying to avoid trouble. So the arguments got louder and less measured. And over years of being ignored and mocked and occasionally arrested, the scholar became the street preacher not because he went mad, but because his expertise made him unable to pretend the question did not matter, and every medium he had tried for expressing that had failed. Talos himself, the being Hrothgar, is dying on a hill to defend, is one of the most remarkable figures in Tamrielic history. He began as a mortal man, born in the Second Era, under the name Hjalti Early Beard, though whether he was born on the island of Alcair or in Etmora is one of the many historical debates that swirl around his life. He served under the Cyrodiilic king Culcain and rose to generalship through military brilliance, eventually uniting the fragmented provinces of Tamriel through a combination of strategic genius, personal charisma, and the thu'um. When the Nords heard him shout at the Battle of Sancre, Tor heard a general's voice carry the power of the voice that is supposed to be uniquely Nordic. They recognized him as the son of Skyrim, the heir to the empire of men, and they submitted rather than continue to resist. He became Tiber Septim. He crowned himself Emperor of Tamriel. He built the Septim dynasty that would rule for 3 full eras. He used the Numidium, the brass god that Khagrenac had built and that had been recovered in various parts from Morrowind to crush the last resistant kingdoms. He died in the Third Era's 38th year, at the age of 108, the oldest person in recorded Tamrielic history, and upon his death, according to the dominant belief of the Imperial and Nordic religions, he ascended. He became a god. He became Talos, the 9th divine, the god of war and governance. There are scholars who argue that Tiber Septim achieved divinity through the process called mantling, that he so completely embodied the role of the dragonborn emperor, so thoroughly enacted the pattern of divine kingship, that reality accepted him as genuinely divine rather than merely acting divine. There are scholars who argue that 3 separate mortal identities, Tiber Septim, his battle mage, Zurin Arctus, and the ancient Nord king, Wismer Wolfhearth, were somehow merged through the metaphysical upheaval of the Numidium's activation, and that Talos, as a divine being, is a composite of all three. There are Altmeri scholars, specifically the Thalmor, who argue that none of this happened, that Talos was simply a man who conquered things and then died, and that the divine status attributed to him is a political mythology created by the empire he founded to give his legacy supernatural legitimacy. The Thalmor's objection matters because it drove the Great War. The Aldmeri Dominion, the political entity controlled by the Altmer of the Somerset Isles, considers the worship of Talos to be an affront, not merely politically, theologically. The Altmeri religious framework is rooted in the belief that the original divine beings were all elves, that the gods are an elven achievement, and that the idea of a human being becoming divine represents a profound corruption of the proper divine order. If Talos is real, then a human transcended the boundary that the Altmeri worldview places between mortal and divine. If Talos is real, then mortals can achieve what the gods achieved. The implications extend far beyond Talos worship. They challenge the entire premise of Altmeri religious and political supremacy. The white gold concordat that banned Talos worship was the price the empire paid to end a war it could not definitively win. The empire was weakened, depleted, its armies reduced, its territory diminished. The Dominion was stronger and able to press further advantages. Titus Mede II signed the Concordat, knowing it was humiliating and knowing it would breed resentment. Evidence found in the Thalmor embassy in Skyrim suggests the Concordat was designed with this in mind. The Thalmor wanted the terms to be humiliating enough to generate resentment and ultimately rebellion, because a divided, internally conflicted human polity is easier to dominate than a unified one. The Stormcloak rebellion that forms the Civil War backdrop of Skyrim's main narrative is, at its most fundamental level, a war about whether a man can be a god. Ulfric Stormcloak fights because his people cannot worship the divine being they believe in. The Empire enforces the ban because it believes fighting the Thalmor now, over this question, is a battle it cannot win, and that strategic patience is worth the theological cost. Both positions have their internal logic. Both positions have their moral compromise. And underneath all of it, in every temple and every roadside shrine, whether in stone effigies or whispered prayers that could get you arrested if the wrong person hears them, Nords keep worshipping Talos. Because for them, Talos is not a political question. He is family. He is the divine expression of what they believe human beings are capable of at their absolute best. He is proof that greatness is not the exclusive province of gods or elves, that a person who is skilled enough and driven enough and connected enough to the deep power of their heritage can transcend the limitations of mortality entirely. Heimskr stands in the market square and shouts because he knows this, because he has studied it more deeply than anyone else in Whiterun and cannot in good conscience be quiet about it. The noise is irritating. The conviction behind it is not. The Thalmor embassy, sitting on a ridge north of Solitude, where Skyrim's High King nominally rules and the Empire's presence is strongest, contains documents that reward careful reading during the diplomatic immunity quest. Most players who complete that quest are focused on the specific piece of evidence they are sent to retrieve, the information about the dragon threat. The documents surrounding that information, the correspondence, the personnel files, the strategic assessments, tell a different story. Ulfric Stormcloak is classified in those documents as an asset, not a declared agent, not a willing collaborator, an asset with the specific qualifier unwitting. During the Great War, Ulfric was captured by the Thalmor and interrogated. He gave information not because he wanted to, but because the Thalmor are very good at obtaining information, and the distinction between voluntary and involuntary cooperation mattered much less to them than the information itself. What he told them was used to Thalmor advantage, and in the years since his capture, the Thalmor have maintained awareness of his activities and occasionally created conditions that nudged his choices in directions useful to them, not controlling him directly, but shaping the environment around him such that the choices he makes independently tend to produce outcomes they want. Ulfric does not know any of this. He is, in the document's language, most valuable in his current state, meaning that his usefulness to the Thalmor depends on him remaining unaware that he is being used. And Ulfric, who discovered the Thalmor's interest in his rebellion, would stop being useful. So the information stays classified, and he continues leading his rebellion with complete sincerity, never knowing that the war he is fighting for, Nordic independence, is producing exactly the result his enemies want: a divided, weakened province bleeding soldiers and resources that would otherwise be available to resist Aldmeri Dominion aggression. The civil war in Skyrim has no good ending. This is not a cynical reading of the narrative. It is the literal conclusion that careful engagement with the lore produces. Imperial victory maintains the Talos ban, prolongs the theological wound, and keeps Skyrim tethered to an empire that already demonstrated it will sacrifice Nordic religious freedom for political survival. Stormcloak victory creates an independent Skyrim with no imperial support against an opponent that the full empire struggled to fight to a draw. The Thalmor benefit from either outcome. A united human polity is the only thing that poses a genuine long-term threat to Aldmeri dominance, and either outcome of the civil war damages the potential for that unity. The documents in the embassy spell this out in the calm, strategic language of people who have thought several generations ahead. What the Civil War questline ultimately teaches, if you engage with it fully, is that genuine conflicts between genuine grievances do not resolve cleanly. Both sides are right about some things. Both sides are wrong about others. Both sides are being manipulated by forces they cannot see. The player is forced to choose anyway, with incomplete information and imperfect options, which is an accurate simulation of how most significant political decisions actually work. Part 8. The Greybeards and the Way of the Voice. High Hrothgar stands at 7,000 steps. The path that winds up the throat of the world from Ivarstead is one of the most famous walks in all of gaming. Physically challenging, not because the game makes it difficult, but because it is very long, and the wind is persistent, and the scale of the mountain becomes increasingly apparent as you climb. You are going somewhere high, genuinely high. The air gets thinner, not mechanically. The game does not simulate altitude sickness, but the atmosphere around you changes. The world below falls away. The sound changes. And eventually, the massive stone doors of the monastery come into view, and you push them open and step inside, and the 4 ancient men who live here turn toward you and say nothing. The Greybeards do not speak, not in any conventional sense. What they do, the wordless bow, the gesture toward the center of the room, the careful communication through written notes and deliberate silence, is not shyness or a speech impediment. It is the most profound possible expression of respect for the power they carry. Because these men can reshape reality with their voices, not metaphorically, not exaggeratedly. The same thu'um that the Dragonborn wields that same connection to Dovazul, the language that makes things real through sound, the Greybeards have mastered so completely over so many decades of study and meditation that they cannot speak without creating consequences. A casual word in the dragon tongue would cause avalanches. The vibrations of uncontrolled Dovazul resonate with the physical structure of the world around it. Stone cracks, ground shakes, the air itself pressurizes and releases. When Arngir, the one Greybeard who speaks with the Dragonborn at all, using regular language specifically as an accommodation, specifically to avoid accidentally causing devastation when Arngir speaks, he is using inferior, limited, less powerful human language instead of his native tongue, because his native tongue is too powerful to use in conversation. That is an extraordinary statement about what the Greybeards are. And then there is the moment of the summons. When the Greybeards called to the Dragonborn just once, just their name, in the thu'um, the shout was visible and audible from every location in Skyrim simultaneously. Guards in Riften commented on hearing it. Jarls in Windhelm discussed it. Common people in Solitude expressed awe and fear. Every living person in the province experienced the summons at the same moment, because the 4 Greybeards shouted one word at full power, and the world felt it. They could have done that any time. They choose, every day, not to. The discipline required to possess that level of power and sit in silence with it, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, it is more impressive than any act of destruction. Anyone can shout down a mountain. These men choose to whisper. Jurgen Windcaller founded the philosophy that governs the Greybeards, and understanding him requires understanding the context of the Second Era's Battle of Red Mountain, a conflict that had nothing to do with the First Era's Dwemer disappearance at Red Mountain and is a different event, entirely in a period of Tamrielic history that often causes confusion, precisely because the same geographic name keeps appearing in different contexts. In the Second Era, Nordic tongue warriors trained in the thu'um fought a military campaign and suffered a devastating defeat despite their mastery of the voice. They had believed the thu'um made them invincible. The defeat proved it did not. Jurgen Windcaller was one of the greatest tongues of his era. He survived the battle and spent years in meditation afterward, trying to understand what it meant. The conclusion he reached was both humble and radical. The defeat had happened because the thu'um was being used wrongly. Reality-altering vocal power was not a weapon. It was a gift, a divine gift, given not for warfare, but for worship, for meditation, for the contemplation of the fundamental nature of existence. Using it as casually as a sword, deploying it tactically in military conflicts, treating it as just another implement of war, this dishonored the gift and invited catastrophic consequences. The defeat at Red Mountain was not the thu'um's failure. It was humanity's failure to understand what the thu'um was for. His philosophy, the way of the voice, is the founding doctrine of the Greybeards. It does not prohibit the use of the thu'um in all cases. There is acknowledgement that times of absolute necessity exist, but it requires that every use of the voice be deliberate, considered, and aligned with the understanding that you are not merely shouting, but participating in the most fundamental process of reality. You are speaking in the language that existence itself runs on. That deserves more than casual deployment. The Greybeards' extended lifespans are a consequence of this mastery. The deepest practice of the way of the voice changes the practitioner at a biological level, not through magic exactly, but through the same mechanism that makes the thu'um work at all. When you train your body and mind to interface with Dovazul, you change the way time and existence interact with your physical form. The masters at High Hrothgar have been there for decades, some for centuries. They age, but slowly. They experience time differently than ordinary mortals, which is part of why they seem so disconnected from current events. They are, literally, running at a different temporal clock. What feels like urgent crisis to someone with a normal human lifespan can feel like a slight uptick in background activity to someone who has been meditating on the same mountain for 100 years. Paarthurnax is up there with them, above the monastery at the throat of the world's summit, alone. He is not part of the Greybeards' community exactly. He is the master they learn from, the teacher above the teachers, the oldest and most knowledgeable practitioner of the way of the voice alive, and also a dragon who committed serious atrocities during the Dragon War and has been atoning through solitary meditation for thousands of years. The Greybeards go up to him periodically. They learn from him, and then they go back to their monastery, and he remains alone in the cold. He told the Dragonborn something that has stayed in the conversation around this game since Skyrim released, that the true struggle is not external, not the Dragon War, not Alduin, not the political conflicts of the mortal world. The true struggle is internal. What is better, he asked, to be born good, to be naturally inclined toward virtue, to find it easy and instinctive, or to overcome your evil nature through great effort? He is not asking a theoretical question. He is asking about his own life. He was born a dragon. He was born with every instinct oriented toward domination. Every morning he wakes up on that mountain, he is still a dragon. The instincts did not go away. The desire to rule, to dominate, to consume that is still in him, as fundamental to his nature as breathing. He chooses every day not to act on it. He calls it the greatest battle he has ever fought. He says he does not always win. The word walls scattered across Skyrim are monuments that predate written Nordic history. Ancient practitioners of the thu'um, in the era when the voice was used commonly for both peace and war, carved the words of power into stone at the locations where they were first used in significant ways. Many of those locations are battle sites, places where a tongue warrior shouted a shout for the first time in genuine desperate need, where the word carved into the wall is the record of that person's extremity. When the Dragonborn approaches and absorbs the understanding embedded in the carving, they are receiving not just a mechanical ability, but a transfer of knowledge across thousands of years of stone. Before Jurgen Windcaller and the Way of the Voice, the thu'um was a military tool as commonplace as a sword among certain warriors. Nordic armies fielded tongue warriors in coordinated formations. The shout that becomes unrelenting force was used as an opener before infantry charges, deployed in coordinated salvos to break enemy formations before the regular troops ran in. The shout that slows time was used by commanders to extend their decision-making window in the chaos of battle. These were tactical tools, refined and iterated over generations of warfare. The word walls are the records of that refinement, the physical locations where specific tactical insights were discovered and committed to permanent memory in stone. By the Fourth Era, almost no one can read these walls. The Dovazul characters mean nothing to modern Nords passing by. Guards walk past them on patrol routes without knowing they are walking past repositories of knowledge that took generations of gifted practitioners to accumulate and encode. The walls stand in the rain and the snow, completely patient, waiting for someone who can read them. The Dragonborn is, in many respects, the first person in living memory who can. That is the Greybeards' gift to the Dragonborn. Not the specific shouts, not the specific techniques, but the understanding that the greatest power available to anyone who touches the thu'um is the power to choose how to use it. The dragons believed power was truth. Paarthurnax believes restraint is wisdom. The Greybeards have lived in the cold for centuries to prove it. Part 9. The Blood of Molagbal, Vampires and What They Cost. Before there were vampire clans, before there were Daughters of Coldharbour, before there were pureblood strains and diluted strains, and the complex political hierarchies of undead nobility, before any of that, there was one moment in the Merethic Era, and one woman, and a Daedric prince, who decided that domination was not complete until it could be passed on. Lemay Beolfag was a Nedic woman. The Nedic people were the original humans of the Alik'r Desert region, the ancestors of the Redguards, and they lived in the northern provinces of Tamriel in the Merethic Era. Lemay was, by all surviving accounts, an ordinary person, a virgin, the records specify. Though, whether this detail matters theologically, or was simply what struck the early chroniclers, is unclear. What is clear is that Molagbal chose her. Molagbal is the Daedric prince of domination and enslavement, the lord of brutality and subjugation, the patron of the most complete and consuming forms of power over another being. His plane of oblivion, Coldharbour, is a gray and broken mirror of Mundus, a dimensionally collapsed version of the mortal world, drained of color and life and possibility, where souls are enslaved and tormented by Daedra for his entertainment. He does not merely want to win, he wants his opponents to understand that they lost. He wants resistance to be not just futile, but degrading. His interest in mortal beings is not predatory in the animal sense. Animals do not delight in the psychological dimension of conquest. Molagbal delights in exactly that. He violated Lemay, he shed a drop of his blood on her brow, and left her to die. She died that night, alone, as her funeral pyre began to burn around her, and then she rose. The fire did not consume her. She rose from it as the first vampire, carrying the corruption of Molagbal's blood, driven by hunger and rage, and the specific kind of grief that comes from surviving something that should have destroyed you, only to find that what you survived it as is something you did not ask to become. Every vampire in Tamriel traces their existence, in some chain of transmission, back to Lemay. The disease she carried spread through blood, through bite, through more acts of violation, through the deliberate creation of more vampires by those who were already vampires. Pure-blood vampires, like the Volkihar clan's progenitors, are those who receive the condition directly from Molagbal himself through a ritual or a direct conferral. Their blood is closest to the original source, and they are correspondingly more powerful, capable of the vampire lord transformation, of a range of abilities that diluted vampires cannot access. Lord Harkon, the patriarch of the Volkihar clan, tells his story himself, if you ask. He was a king. He ruled a domain that he describes as vast and powerful. He was strong, successful, feared, and mortal, and mortality terrified him. He made a bargain with Molagbal. He would sacrifice 1,000 innocent souls to the Daedric prince, and in return, Molagbal would grant him and his family true vampirism, pure blood. The Volkihar progenitor line. He paid the price. 1,000 souls, and Molag Bal delivered, turning Harkon and his immediate family into pure-blood vampires, making them the founding line of what would become the Volkihar clan. They established Castle Volkihar on a remote island in the Sea of Ghosts, north of Solitude, and built from there a Gothic fortress of genuine scale and dark grandeur, a court of vampire nobles that conducted politics and alliances and betrayals across the centuries, in the way that vampire nobility always does in these stories, with great patience and no mercy. Serana, Harkon's daughter, is one of the game's most fully realized characters. She was sealed in a tomb centuries before the events of Skyrim, locked in by her mother Valerica as a desperate protective measure to keep her from Harkon's increasingly obsessive scheme. She emerges from that tomb having no idea what year it is, no idea what has happened in the world since she was sealed away, and no idea whether the people she cared about are still alive. Her disorientation is handled with a delicacy that makes her feel real rather than archaic. She adapts, she asks questions, she processes the elapsed time with the mixture of grief and pragmatic forward motion that someone would actually use if they woke up from centuries of sleep to find the world had moved on without them. Harkon's obsession, the central conflict of the Dawnguard questline, is the prophecy of Ariel's bow. The bow belongs to Ariel, the same divine being the snow elves worshipped. The elven interpretation of Akatosh and its power over sunlight is extraordinary. Blood-cursed elven arrows, fired from Ariel's bow, can block the sun entirely. No more sunlight. No more vampire's primary weakness. An eternal twilight from which undead predators could emerge without limit, hunt without restriction, live without the constant management of the sun's danger. Harkon wants this not merely as a tactical advantage, but as a theological statement, the eternal night, as proof of vampiric supremacy, the final reversal of the vulnerability that Ariel's sanctification of the sun created. The Dawnguard, the vampire hunters, who serve as the questline's other faction, were a historical institution that had gone dormant when the vampire threat seemed manageable, and that were reformed by the former vigilant of Stendar, named Isran, specifically in response to the Volkihar clan's renewed activity. Isran is not a comfortable person. He is rigid, suspicious, borderline paranoid, and deeply uninterested in nuance. He will not let Serana, a vampire, who has actively helped the Dragonborn inside the Dawnguard's fortress. He distrusts, compromises, and half-measures, and anyone whose judgment he has not personally verified. In a more comfortable narrative, he would be the unreasonable authority figure whose rigidity creates problems. In the specific context of the Dawnguard questline, he is simply correct. The vampires are actively planning to blot out the sun. This is not a situation that benefits from nuanced diplomatic engagement. The Volkihar clan itself, as you encounter them in the castle, is a fascinating environment to spend time in. It is a court. It has politics. There are factions within the clan. Vingalmo and Orthalf, the two advisors, hate each other and are both angling for advantageous position in the clan's power structure. There are scholars and alchemists and warriors and tacticians, all undead, all conducting the business of a noble house that has been operational for centuries. The castle contains a library, a laboratory, a forge, a dining room that no one eats in, a crypt that everyone lives in. It is, in its way, a functional institution, just one, organized around predation rather than production. The theological question at the center of the Dawnguard questline, whether vampires can choose to coexist with mortals, whether the nature conferred by Molag Bal's curse is something that can be directed rather than simply acted upon, is answered differently by different characters. Harkon says no. Vampires are predators, mortals are prey. The relationship is, if you are. Serana says yes. She has made choices about how she uses her condition. She has maintained relationships and loyalties, and something that functions like love. She is more than what Molag Bal made her. Harkon's version is the vampire as pure principle of domination. Serana's version is the vampire as a person who carries a curse. The questline does not resolve the tension neatly. It just asks you to choose. Part 10. The Daedric Princes and the Edges of What Exists. Beyond the mountains of Skyrim, beyond the political conflicts and the dragon wars and the histories of races rising and falling beyond all of it. There are 16 beings who have watched everything with interest and occasionally with appetite. The Daedric princes are neither good nor evil in any framework that maps onto conventional morality. They are powers, each embodying a specific aspect or principle of existence, each ruling a plane of oblivion that reflects their nature and operates according to their will. They do not age. They do not die, at least not in any way that the mortal world has access to. They do not grow. They simply are fixed expressions of specific aspects of existence that have been fixed since before the mortal world began. Hermaeus Mora is the most patient of them. He is the prince of knowledge and fate, the inevitable knower, the demon of knowledge titles that all gesture toward the same underlying principle. He collects information, all information. Every book ever written, and many that have not been yet, reside in Apocrypha, his realm of oblivion, an infinite library that stretches in every direction without end. Black pools reflect fluorescent green light. Floating tentacles brush against towering shelves. Seekers and lurkers maintain an order that is more obsession than organization. You can read an Apocrypha for as long as you like, but leaving requires either a very specific magical artifact or the prince's permission, and his permission always has a price. Hermaeus Mora does not take souls through violence. He does not need to. He collects them through their own most powerful impulse. Every scholar, every mage, every person whose primary drive is to understand the world and who would sacrifice almost anything for greater knowledge, these are his people. He offers them exactly what they want. The black books scattered across Solstheim are his lures, each one a direct connection to Apocrypha, each one offering something, a power, a truth, an insight in exchange for the act of reading them. Each reading binds the reader slightly more firmly into Mora's web. By the time they realize they are in debt to him, they are usually in too deep to find a way out that does not require something extraordinary. Merethic, the first dragonborn, was his greatest collection. A dragon priest of the early dragon cult, Merethic discovered his dragonborn power and recognized it as something the dragons would never willingly allow a mortal to understand or develop. He began conspiring against his dragon overlords. Another priest, Valok, discovered the betrayal and confronted him. The battle between them was so catastrophically powerful that it physically separated Solstheim from the Skyrim mainland, tearing the island away through raw magical violence and creating the strait that now separates them. You can see this in the geography. Solstheim sits off Skyrim's northeastern coast and was, once, part of the same land. The battle between two dragon priests changed the shape of the world. Valok won, but Hermaeus Mora intervened before Merethic could be destroyed. Mora swept him into Apocrypha, offering sanctuary in exchange for service. And Merethic, faced with death or service to the Prince of Knowledge, chose service. He spent thousands of years in Apocrypha, reading, growing in power, consuming the books and the knowledge, becoming something that blended mortal ambition with Daedric influence in ways that even Mora may not have fully anticipated. By the time the last Dragonborn arrives on Solstheim, Merethic is attempting to return to the mortal world, not because Mora wants him to, but because he wants to. And Mora, who finds this amusing and useful, allows it to play out, because the outcome of the conflict between the two Dragonborns will produce outcomes he can study and use, regardless of who wins. Meridia is different from most Daedric princes in a way that makes her unusual enough to warrant attention. She was not originally Daedric at all. She was a Magna Gay, one of the children of Magnus, the architect of reality's magical framework, who fled creation before the mortal world was complete. She became fascinated with mortals and chose to remain involved with the mortal world rather than withdrawing with her kin. This choice was considered aberrant by the other divine beings. It violated their understanding of how the relationship between the divine and the mortal worked, and she was eventually cast out. She became Daedric by default, a being without a proper category in the existing framework, occupying the space adjacent to oblivion because there was nowhere else for her to be. Her hatred of undeath is not political. It is personal. She was associated with life and light in her original divine function, and she understands necromancy and vampirism as violations of the natural order she helped create. When you reanimate a corpse, you are hijacking the mechanism of existence in a way that offends Meridia at the level of theological principle. When a vampire drinks blood to sustain an undead existence, they are living in defiance of the life-death cycle that Meridia considers fundamental to the world's proper operation. Her gifting of Dawnbreaker, a blade specifically enchanted to destroy undead and scatter them so they cannot be raised again, is not mere generosity, it is recruitment. She is creating an army of mortal instruments to do the work she cannot do directly, extending her crusade against undeath through every wielder of that blade. She is probably one of the most benevolent of the Daedric princes from a mortal perspective, though calling her benevolent requires acknowledging that her methods are not gentle. She is fanatical. She does not distinguish between a vampire who preys on children and a vampire who feeds ethically and has chosen coexistence. They are all undead. They all offend the principle she embodies. Her definition of justice is broader and more absolute than most mortals would be comfortable with. She is an ally, but she is not a friend. Her gifts come with expectations, and her expectations do not leave much room for the specific circumstances of individual situations. Sheogorath, the Prince of Madness, is in Skyrim in a peculiar way. The Sheogorath, who speaks to the Dragonborn during the quest that takes place in a painting, and who provides the Wabbajack as his signature artifact, is almost certainly not the original Sheogorath. The original Sheogorath was drawn to oblivion by the original Greymarch, and in his place arose the champion of Cyrodiil from the events of the Shivering Isles expansion, a mortal who mantled Sheogorath so completely, who performed the role of the Prince of Madness with such total commitment that when reality looked at the situation, it could not distinguish the original from the copy. Mantling, in Elder Scrolls cosmology, works this way. If you become something thoroughly enough, you become it, not metaphorically. Actually, the cosmos itself cannot tell the difference. And since there is no higher authority than the cosmos to appeal to, the difference ceases to matter. This particular Sheogorath is slightly more coherent than depictions of the original. He makes more linear sense. His madness is performative in ways that the original Sheogorath's was supposedly not the original, was described as genuinely, deeply, structurally insane, in ways that went beyond personality. This iteration is a man who is very good at playing mad, and occasionally forgets to play when the memory of being immortal surfaces. His quest involves treating the mind of a dead Jarl, and his methodology using the Wabbajack to alter the psychological landscape of an unconscious mind. Creating and destroying constructs made of memory and fear is more creative than it is chaotic. He is enjoying himself. There is a difference between someone who experiences chaos as their natural state and someone who chooses chaos as their aesthetic, and this Sheogorath is the latter. The Soul Cairn deserves its own mention in any serious exploration of Daedric afterlife geography. It is not precisely a Daedric prince's plane. It exists in the space between Oblivion and Mundus, maintained by entities called the Ideal Masters, who were once mortal sorcerers, and who traded their own physical existence for pure magical power, with the result that they are now massive crystalline structures of approximately zero empathy and considerable power. The Soul Cairn is where souls end up when they are trapped in black soul gems, not their final destination, not Sovngarde or any other divine afterlife, but an imprisonment. The purple-gray wasteland, stretching in all directions, populated by the shades of people who committed no crime except being killed by someone with a soul trap spell active. Their bodies were used for enchantments. Their souls were redirected here. Every enchanted weapon you use in Skyrim, every enchanted piece of armor, every magical implement represents someone's soul diverted from its natural path into a prison dimension. When you walk through the Soul Cairn during the Dawnguard questline, you are walking through a moral horror. The shades you see are not monsters. They are people, or the echoes of people, who are simply stuck. Some of them speak. They ask where they are. They remember the lives they had. They do not understand why they are here. They have been here for varying lengths of time, and the experience does not become more comprehensible with familiarity. Arvak's story, the horse whose spirit is in the cairn, whose owner's shade wanders, asking you to find him, the reunion you engineer between a dead person and their dead horse so they can ride through eternity together, is one of the game's most genuinely touching moments, precisely because it is small and specific and takes place in a landscape of cosmic horror. One small kindness in an infinite gray prison, one reunion in a dimension of endings. Namira, the Prince of Darkness and Revulsion, completes the picture of what the Daedric princes collectively represent. She is the patron of things that society considers too repulsive to acknowledge: decay, scavenging, the consumption of the dead. Her feast in the Hall of the Dead in Markarth, conducted in secret by people who have found that the ring of Namira's power is worth the cost of becoming someone who sees human corpses as food. It is not presented with obvious moral judgment. The game simply shows you what is there and lets you decide what to do with it. Namira does not care about your opinion of her worshippers. Revulsion, for her, is not a deterrent. It is the point. She honors those who transcend the taboos that define what a person is supposed to be. What the Daedric princes collectively illustrate, when you look at all 16 of them together, is that the universe of the Elder Scrolls is built from principles, and some of those principles are ones that mortals would prefer did not exist. Knowledge destroys those who pursue it too far. Madness is real and constant and patient. Domination seeks new expressions in every generation. Darkness gathers in every corner that light does not reach. The princes are not external threats to a world that would be fine without them. They are expressions of things already present in the world, given form and will and the specific, terrifying quality of being very, very old. Nocturnal deserves a quiet mention in this survey of the princes, because her relationship with Skyrim is more embedded than most players realize. She is the Daedric prince of night, darkness, and luck, or rather, of the absence of luck, of the spaces where chance lives before it commits to a particular outcome. The Thieves Guild's extraordinary success over the years was not purely a function of skill and organization. It was a function of divine patronage. Nocturnal made a pact with the guild's founders, granting them her favor in exchange for devotion and service, expressed through the very specific ritual of guarding her twilight sepulchre, a sacred site dedicated to her that the guild's members are sworn to protect. The skeleton key, her Daedric artifact, was the physical symbol of this pact, a lockpick that never breaks, and that, more importantly, kept the flow of luck running in the guild's direction. When Mercer Frey, the guild's corrupt leader during Skyrim's events, stole the skeleton key for personal use and broke the pact, the guild's fortunes collapsed. Not symbolically, literally. Contracts went wrong, fences got caught, members were arrested or killed. The supernatural luck that had made impossible jobs routine simply stopped, and the guild, suddenly operating on skill alone in a world that required more than skill, began to fail. Recovering the skeleton key and returning it to the Twilight Sepulchre is not just a questline resolution. It is the reinstatement of a divine bargain, and the guild's subsequent revival reflects Nocturnal's favor, returning to them as tangibly as it had left. What the Thieves Guild storyline reveals about Nocturnal is interesting. She is not generous in the way that Meridia is almost generous, or even in the transactional way that most Daedric princes who offer rewards operate. Her pact is a genuine ongoing relationship, not a one-time trade. She provides sustained benefit in exchange for sustained service. The Nightingales, the guild's elite members who serve Nocturnal, directly accept that upon their deaths, their souls go to her service in the Evergloam, her plane of oblivion. They know this. They agree to it. Carlia, Brynjolf, and the Dragonborn all become Nightingales with full knowledge of the cost. It is a deal, a real one, with real terms, on both sides. Whether that is reassuring or troubling depends entirely on your perspective. The 16 planes of oblivion, each one reflecting its prince's nature, each one operating on rules fundamentally different from Mundus, represent the full range of what existence contains. Hermaeus Mora's Apocrypha is endless library, and endless learning, and endless cost. Meridia's colored rooms are ordered and lit and hostile to anything that is not alive. Sheogorath's shivering isles are divided between mania and dementia, vivid and beautiful and deeply wrong. Molag Bal's Cold Harbor is a gray, drained, architectural nightmare where mortals are property. What you see in Skyrim is only a narrow band of existence. Behind the mountains and beyond the sky, there are entire dimensions waiting, each one the territory of a prince who has had since before the mortal world began to arrange things exactly the way they want them. A closing note from the mountain. The fire has burned down low now. The wolves outside have gone quiet. The wind has settled into its night. Rhythm, not calm, exactly. Never quite calm in Skyrim, but steady, predictable. Something you can sleep under. Everything we have covered tonight, the Dragon War, the Dwemer's fatal ambition, the vast corridors of Blackreach, the Snow Elves' long tragedy, the Nordic soul's journey towards Sovngarde, the Night Mother's ancient bargain, Tiber Septim's impossible ascent, the Greybeards' mountain vigil, the long shadow of Molag Bal's first act of creation, the princes who watch from the edges of everything. None of it is window dressing. None of it is flavor text that exists just to be discovered and checked off. It is the bones of a world, and the bones hold up everything else. Every dragon that rises from a burial mound, every draugr that opens its red eyes in a Nordic tomb, every piece of Dwemer machinery that keeps grinding away in the dark, they all make sense within this framework. They are all connected to everything else by threads that go back to the beginning. One of the quietly remarkable things about Skyrim's lore is how many of its stories are about the specific cost of ambition. Kagrenak and the Dwemer paid the price of trying to engineer their own divinity. Miraak paid the price of wanting power he was not meant to have. Harkon paid the price of making a deal with a Daedric prince out of fear rather than understanding. Tiber Septim, depending on which scholar you ask, either transcended the price entirely or paid it in ways that are not yet visible. The pattern repeats because the world of the Elder Scrolls is honest about something that most stories prefer to soft pedal, that the desire to be more than what you are is not simply heroic. It is also the most dangerous impulse that any being, mortal or otherwise, can act on. The Dragonborn is, arguably, Tamriel's response to this pattern, a mortal who possesses dragon power, but through the guidance of the Greybeards, through Paarthurnax's example, through the explicit teaching that the thu'um is a responsibility rather than a weapon, has the philosophical framework to handle it with something approaching wisdom. Whether any individual player's Dragonborn actually embodies that wisdom is between them and their save file. The capacity is there. The framework is offered. What gets done with it depends on choices that the game, respectfully and without moralizing, leaves entirely to you. That is the final thing worth carrying away from all of this. Skyrim gives you extraordinary power and asks, without demanding, what you will do with it. It shows you what happened when power was pursued without restraint, the Dwemer, gone. When power was corrupted by contact with domination, the Snow Elves, broken. When power was used only for destruction, the Dragon War, centuries of suffering. And it shows you Paarthurnax, who had more power than almost any other being in the game and spent thousands of years learning to be still with it. The choice is always available. The world holds all of it at once, the cautionary examples and the worthy ones, and asks which kind of story you want to participate in. There is also something to be said about the companions in this larger conversation about power and its cost. Their werewolf secret, the beast blood that the circle carries, passed through ritual infection rather than freely chosen, binding each new member to a condition they may not fully understand before they commit to it, is the companion's oldest moral weight. The organization that began as Wisegrammer's extermination force became a force of Nordic warrior tradition and eventually evolved into something approaching a neutral guild of honorable warriors for hire, has been carrying this secret at its core for generations. The circle members who hold it differ in their relationship to it. Some are proud, some are resigned, some are quietly desperate for a way out. All of them are bound by it, and all of them die knowing that Sovngarde may not welcome them because of a choice made before they fully understood the theology. Companions who die with the beast blood do not go to Sovngarde. They go to the hunting grounds, Hircine's realm, where the great spirit of the hunt runs his prey across endless wilderness for eternity. Some companions have been told this and accepted it as a warrior's afterlife of a different kind. Others have fought against it, as Kodlak fought against it, seeking a cure that would restore their chance at the Nordic heaven they believed they had earned. The werewolf storyline is not about the power of the transformation or the enhanced combat capabilities. It is about what you are willing to accept as the price of belonging to something, and whether that price can ever be paid off, or whether some debts are permanent. Kodlak's final quest, which continues after his death, driven by the Dragonborn on his behalf, is an act of love on the player's part. You are fighting for someone who cannot fight for themselves anymore. You are trying to give a good man the ending he deserved. Skyrim is 13 years old as a game, and it is still giving people things to find. It is still generating conversations, filling community wikis and forum threads and late-night videos watched by people who should probably be asleep with new angles on old questions. What happened to the Dwemer? Is Paarthurnax redeemable? Which side of the Civil War is morally defensible? What is Sithis, really? These questions do not have consensus answers. They probably never will. And that absence of finality is a feature rather than a failure. It is still generating conversations about what things mean and how they connect and what was intended and what emerged from the space between intention and execution. That is what great world building does. It creates a space large enough that discovery never fully ends. There are books in Skyrim's inns and libraries and ruins that most players have never read, 337 of them, containing a combined 316,000 words of law and history and fiction and philosophy, more words than the entire first Lord of the Rings book, and approaching half of Tolkien's complete trilogy. Bethesda hired actual writers to create this library. They treated world building as something worth doing with the care of actual literature, not just the effort of a background feature. There are characters who pass through a single city and have complete backstories that no quest forces you to investigate. There are ruins with histories that only the ruins themselves can tell you, if you pay attention to how they are laid out and what they contain and what that implies. The Dragonborn story is finished. Alduin is gone. The world goes on. And somewhere in it, Paarthurnax is still sitting on that mountain, fighting the same battle he has always fought, choosing silence over the words his nature wants him to say. The Greybeards are still climbing those 7,000 steps in their meditations. Gelebor is still in his forgotten vale, still waiting, still tending the shrine of a god he has not seen in thousands of years. The Dwemer machinery is still running in the dark underground, patient and purposeless and perfect. The Eye of Magnus is sealed away somewhere, even the most dedicated scholars cannot find. All of it continues. The world does not stop because the player's adventure ends. It breathes, slowly and independently, in the dark. Let yourself breathe with it now. You do not need to go anywhere. You do not need to do anything. Skyrim will still be there in the morning, and all its histories will still be in it. And if you want to go back and look more carefully at any of the things we talked about tonight, you will find that the world rewards the looking. It always does. Rest well, cozy night. The fire will keep going a little while longer. You have earned some quiet. If you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you. Drop a like if you enjoyed the deep dive tonight, and if you are not yet subscribed, consider it. There is a lot more where this came from. Every great game has a world underneath it, and we are going to spend a lot of nights looking at what is underneath. Until next time, sleep well.